Good afternoon, Peter, comrade. We had a wonderful World Congress where we discussed all the issues concerning the world at length. We also had a very detailed commission and a plenary session on South Asia, and I was very happy to touch upon that were touched upon many issues in relation to the present political situation in India, both economic and political. But the present situation in India is complex, as I explained in the World Congress, and also which other comrades agreed to. But the complexity is further. It's a kind of a quagmire because of the characterization of the present Modi regime, Modi-led BJP regime in India, is full of follies, full of many mistakes, especially from the left, the dominant left. Since the advent of Modi-led BJP, of course, there is a lot of skirmishes, lot of pinpricks, which are divisive in nature, especially socially and politically as well. And the left, like the CPM, CPI, even the Maoists, jump to the conclusion and call the Modi regime as a fascist regime. So, in our understanding, we don't use the terminology of fascism so flippantly. So I just wanted your input into it.
Well, I think that the current situation in India is very interesting. The idea that the BJP has got an overwhelming mandate to carry through its so-called free market ideology, privatization, attacks on wages, introduction of more neoliberal measures is quite false, because they got a minority vote in percentage terms in the general election, which has been trumpeted in India and throughout the world as a great achievement of the BJP. Of course, we would wish that wouldn't have been the case, that a left alternative would have been supported by the Indian people as a whole. It's there, it's in power, but to describe what is a reactionary government, a government that is going to introduce even more and more pro-capitalist, pro-landlord measures to the detriment of the overwhelming majority of working people, the working class and the poor peasants and so on, that government, to describe that as fascist, is quite wrong. Because the terminology of Marxist is chosen very carefully. We don't have a flippant attitude towards terminology. We have the broad description of capitalism as a capitalist regime. But within that, there are different variants. There can be a dictatorship, a Bonapartist dictatorship, which represents a certain stage, if you like, in reaction. But a fascist regime implies that the organizations of the working class have been destroyed, that the ruling class have been successful in mobilizing the middle class, the petty bourgeois, in a mass movement to destroy the organizations of the working class and to atomize the working class. Now, we're far from that in India. Leon Trotsky chose the terminology of bourgeois Bonapartism and different kinds of bourgeois Bonapartism in Germany, for instance, as a description of the different stages of the class struggle. To just describe it as fascist, premature, before Hitler came to power, would have been completely premature. That would have led to the conclusion that the Communist Party drew that all hope is lost. It was a dictatorship, but of a special kind. You can have a parliamentary dictatorship, where a majority in parliament with extra parliamentary measures taken against the organizations of the working class, against democratic rights, and so on. That has some of those features exist in India at the present time, but it's not an open, even bourgeois Bonapartist regime, capitalist Bonapartist regime. It's certainly not fascist, which would mean a long struggle of the working class on democratic rights to get back what they'd lost under the previous regime. And it's actually to demobilize the working class and to dishearten the working class, or the elements of the working class, to describe it as fascist. This is a reactionary regime. Against such a fascist regime, to have a strike of 155 million or 150 million, as we've seen in India, that would have been impossible. because the trade unions will be atomised, the working class will be atomised, the right to vote. You could have the trappings of democracy like Hitler did or Mussolini, but the content would not be there which you would have under bourgeois democracy. That's why we would fight for bourgeois democratic rights. If you have a fascist regime, it's a long struggle where the wheel of history is turned back, and then you have to assemble the working class, assemble their forces for that struggle, and have a programme which is adapted to that. That is not the case in India at the present time.
I mean, thank you for that particular very profound thoughts that you had, because apart from the Stalinist left, the Maoist variety too, even some of the ex-Trotskyists who do not have any organization as such, they muddy the water with terminologies such as communal fascism, caste fascism. I mean, for example, they use Islamic fascism, Hindutva fascism, and such very non-Marxian terms, and muddy the entire thinking process, and that way confuse the working class, especially the advanced layers. So, can religion, extremism, fundamentalism, and intolerance by a particular regime, can they be the basis for a fascist regime?
No, it can't be, by itself. You can have the trappings of religion for a particular form of fascism, if you like, where it can be used to kind of burnish the image of a fascist regime. There are differences, for instance, in the way that the fascist regimes in Spain, of Franco, in Italy, under Mussolini, which after all was the prototype. That's how fascism first developed. And because it developed in Italy, and because the working class was not of the same strength as, for instance, in Germany, which was the strongest working class in the world, and Mussolini had to feel his way, then the forms of fascism, it still destroyed the organizations of the working class. I mean, Mussolini organized armed detachments who were quite small and went into every city and town of Italy and smashed up the organizations of the working class, smashed the headquarters of the Socialist Party and Communist Party. But nevertheless, they didn't have the same effect, and therefore he used the kind of examples of ancient Rome and so on, and invoked national symbols to describe the development of fascism itself. Hitler learned from Mussolini, but because the working class in Germany was much stronger than in Italy, where there were the millions of workers who still had arms from the uprisings of 1918 and 1923, and right at the last moment before the fascists could have taken power, they could have been defeated. In fact, Hitler lost about 1 million votes in the elections just prior to him coming to power. And Leon Trotsky and the genuine Marxists at that time advocated a united front between the Socialists, the Social Democrats, and the Communist Party, a united front of struggle to defeat fascism. And there's no doubt whatsoever about it. If that would have been organised, even at the 11th and a half hour, that would have defeated fascism. But once having come to power with this mighty working class, coward, not completely defeated, because he had difficulties, for instance, with Berlin, Hitler, of going to Berlin. He was very tentatively only went to Berlin, but systematically arrested, not just the Jews, not just opposition or bourgeois opposition to the regime, but primarily Communist Party members, Social Democrats, smashed their organisations, atomised the working class, and then on the basis of that was able to consolidate that regime. But fascism in its classical form can only exist for a very short period, because soon after it goes over to a military police dictatorship with power in the hands of the military caste and so on. They destroyed the basis of fascism like they did in the Night of the Long Knives. The more extreme forms of fascism had to be defeated in order to consolidate what would be a typical capitalist regime, albeit with the elements of fascism. And you could have the same situation in relation to any communal regime or caste regime for that matter. But the difference would be, we don't describe, for instance, ISIL, Daesh, as a classically fascist regime, although some of the methods of fascism are used by them. For instance, it's an open question how many people the Nazis beheaded compared to the number of people that ISIL and Daesh beheaded. The Nazis probably beheaded more people, which was their way of trying to cower the working class. But the difference between that and, let's say, for instance, Muslim fundamentalism it's described, we describe it as right-wing political Islam. Within that broad description, there can be many forms of regime. You can have, certainly, a fascist regime that uses Islam in order to burnish its image, to consolidate its image. On the other hand, under the banner of Islam, or any religion, the working class can be radicalized, can even make a revolution, like Trotsky raised in Britain. You know, the miners in South Wales and elsewhere were under the banner of the Methodists. And he postulated in the future they could embrace Marxism, communism in a genuine sense, a democratic socialist revolution, that they could embrace this and they could make the revolution under the banner of Methodism and of Marxism. And then on the basis of a new society, we could see the way it would develop. Similarly, in the Iranian Revolution, and it was a revolution, which is distinguished by the masses stepping onto the scene of history and taking their fate into their own hands, that in the case of Iran, we had radical Islam under Khomeini, reactionary in many of the ideological things he put forward in arresting the members of the Communist Party, but taking over the majority of industry and beginning to introduce a form of planning. So it's possible that, for instance, in the Middle East or in Pakistan, rather than going under the banner straight away of socialism, you could have radical Islam. So the question of religion embraces all classes, if you like, in a way, represents a certain stage in their development, and it's not specifically in and of itself reactionary. There can be different political expressions of religion, of Islam, of even of Hinduism and so on. We see all kinds of developments like that, but the content will be a social content, a political content that represents the development of a new society.
So you refer to right-wing political Islam,
Yeah.
in which the other trends within the left call it as Islamic fundamentalism or religious extremism.
Yes.
So in that context, how would we explain or how would we characterize the present majoritarian supremacist trend of Hindutva in India?
Well, you've described it very well. It's supremacist, and it's the arrogance of the small elite at the top, using, if you like, the views of the vast majority. I think there's about 1 billion Hindus in India out of 1.2, 1.3 billion, roughly. The present regime, BJP, is a supremacist, is an exclusive, is ultimately the philosophy of the ruling elite in India, the capitalist elite. It's not an accident. The big sections of the bourgeois in India have embraced this, because it's their means of trying to cement a kind of Hindu bloc without class divisions. That's what all ruling capitalist regimes do. They either do it under the banner of Catholicism, under the banner of Protestantism, under the banner of Islam, but they cannot stop the class contradictions that develop under any religion. If you take Ireland, for instance, you see historically the way that the ranks of Catholicism were open to the message of the revolutionaries, with even the priests joining the movement itself. We saw something similar in Latin America, of Catholic liberation theology, with the priests coming very close to Marxism and embracing many of the ideas of Marxism, whereas the hierarchy, the bishops and so on, they lean towards capitalism and ultimately try to defeat liberation theology. You'll have all kinds of contradictions like that, but you will not be able to eliminate the class contradictions in every religion.
Peter, you touched upon the 1 billion which come under the name of Hindu population. And also we know that India has one of the largest Muslim population too, and also the other Christians and Jains and others. But while superficially accepting that it has got a 1 billion Hindu population. But if you look at the caste system within the Hindutva umbrella, a sizable section, maybe half of 1 billion, do not, in a way, historically identify with the Hindu Hindu shelter or Hindu umbrella. But at the same time, because of the certain historical complexities, I mean, BJP artificially brings them under the banner of Hindu majority, and that's how they play with it. But at the same time, can we say that the race and the caste can be equated? Because it's further in this particular society, because of the failure of the left in itself to address the caste question in a dialectical manner, in a militant manner.
Yes.
I mean, they have just browsed it over. I mean, they have just parroted the question of the class while not taking into the actual situation of the caste itself.
Yes.
It overlaps.
Yeah.
So in such a situation, how do we explain and how do we differentiate the race and the caste, and also how do we bring the class analysis of such a situation?
Well, all divisions, all attempts to separate one section of the population from another are inherently wrong. It goes for the class divisions and the caste divisions as well. In a new social society, all class and caste divisions will be abolished. The reality is we've inherited this from previous forms of society, if you like, in India. Just as we inherited divisions from feudalism when feudalism developed into capitalism, there are still feudal relics in Britain, for instance, an advanced industrial country, in the form of the monarchy. We have a king, we have a queen, we have the House of Lords, which are all relics of a previous regime. But consciousness, in general, lags behind the development of events. And the caste system in India, or the caste system in Sri Lanka, and in other societies, and forms of division, of hierarchical separating out of an elite, and then another elite below them, and so on, until you get to the very base of society, to the Dalits in India. They are inherently unjust, are wrong, and we have to say they will be abolished by a new democratic socialist India. And they're a means of trying to tie working people together with their exploiters. Somebody from a similar caste has loyalty to the members of that caste rather than to their class. That's the battle that we would be involved in India. And on the basis of the caste system, that's really to perpetuate the unequal relations that exist at the present time. And moreover, it won't be a question of us agitating about this. The contradictions will be shown in the struggle. It'll shown between the Brahmin hierarchy and the lower caste. It's shown in the discrimination today, the shameful discrimination of the Dalits in India, that has worldwide effect because of this recent suicide of this one individual. That's just one suicide. What about the thousands of other suicides that take place arising from similar social conditions, or arising from the loans of Indian farmers that they can't pay back? They don't want to burden their family, and therefore they commit suicide. You have on the one side huge possibilities with the development of technology, and at the same time these barbaric relics of the past, even predating capitalism, if it comes to that. And moreover, it's possible as well. The division, for instance, that we face in the Middle East today, not between one religion and another, but the primary division is between the Sunni population, or that's the attempt of the tops to present it in that way, between the Sunni population and between the Shia population. That dates back to the millennia, dates back to the 7th century AD. Now, the fact of the matter is that those relations and that antagonism died down to some extent, where you had Shia marrying Sunni and so on. And the same thing probably happened in India as well, although the divisions there are very rigid and so on. And nevertheless, we saw the attempt of workers to come together. Even now, Even after the horrible sectarian divisions from Pakistan, like an arc of sectarianism, right through the Middle East, which is polarizing the situation, producing, huge disruption. Half the population of Syria forced out of the country, horrible, unspeakable crimes being committed on either side, and yet at the same time, we've seen, for instance, it's on a little incident, but it shows the possibility. We saw recently when the Iraqi football team managed to get through to the Olympics, there was a mass turnout in Baghdad and other cities where the workers were celebrating the fact that amongst the misery that they face, they had this success of the Iraqi, as they saw it, the Iraqi people, and they were chanting, "We are not Shias, we are not Sunni, we are Iraqis." A similar thing happened in 2011 and in 2012, where the workers came out. That's the hope for India. That's the hope for the workers of the Middle East, and amongst this unspeakable horror that exists.
Peter, you drew a kind of an internationalist focus on the issue of the class and the caste. The complexity of that particular situation in India is, and also it is the failure in a way of the so-called Marxists, which is dominated by the Stalinist variety in India, that to gloss over the discrimination, to gloss over the injustice that is there, which is historically over centuries, if you like, in the issue of lower castes, that is the Dalits and the Adivasis. So today, in the present context, all their false theories and false emphasis has failed, and suddenly they switch, they swing the pendulum to the other extreme of, in a way, making a slavish concession to identityism, identity politics. On the one hand, they parroted that everything is class and class struggle. Forget about caste; it will disappear. But now they have gone to the other extreme. So, as Marxists, as genuine Marxists, and Trotskyists, how do we take up the question of the caste, and where we see the stark realities of the society today, that they are the working people, may not be in a classical way organized in a manner like in the trade unions or anything, but they do the wealth creation in the society, and also the most laborious work in the society. So how do we look at it?
Well, it's quite wrong to just put forward a basic class position. It's correct to do it in general, to fight for the unity of the interests of the working people. But along the road to socialism, or even winning the confidence of the overwhelming majority of the toilers in India, you not only have to address the general class question, but also their problems as they've developed within society as the legacy of a semi-feudal or feudal background. For instance, in India, or in Britain for that matter, it's not possible to make the socialist revolution or to talk about the socialist revolution unless you're prepared to have an answer in relation to the national question. The Russian Revolution, for instance, would not have been possible without Lenin's views on the national question. Because in Russia, if my memory serves me correctly, it was roughly 43% who were great Russians and 57% were oppressed nationalities. Rosa Luxemburg didn't think it was necessary. She was a great Marxist, but she had a blind spot on the issue of the national question, mostly because of what happened in Poland, where she was based originally, and so on, because there was a national question in Poland. And she wanted to ignore that and concentrate on the question of the unity of the working class. And Lenin correctly pointed out, we would not win the confidence, that's the Marxists in all Russia, unless we addressed the national question and fought for the right of self-determination. And Rosa Luxemburg's argument was, well, that's one step backwards. If all these nations who are united under the Tsarist knot and sabre, if they were divided into different nationalities, that would be a step backwards. The same thing applies to India. We stand for the right of self-determination of what are quite clearly a whole number of nationalities. We are not evangels of separation. We don't say you should separate, but we defend your right of self-determination up to and including the right to separate. Because, as Lenin pointed out, if you separate, if they take this, our position, and they decide to go down this road and separate, they will go down it, like, for instance, the overwhelming majority of the oppressed nationalities in Russia, only then to come back if we combine that demand with the idea of a federation. And we stand for a socialist confederation of the Indian, Pakistan, Sri Lankan subcontinent, within which you would satisfy the demands of the right of self-determination, including up to and including separation, like, for instance, what happened in Finland in 1918 in Russia. And the same thing applies to all the inheritance that we face today of discrimination and of persecution of the most oppressed layers, of the blacks and the Asian population in Britain, of the people of colour in the US. We cannot advance towards unity of the working class without addressing their special needs and their special oppression as well. And that means that we have to find a way of, even now, before we get socialism, of uniting the working class on the basis of the general needs of the working class, but also the special needs and interests of the oppressed minorities themselves. For instance, let me give you an example. We always opposed in Britain positive discrimination, because we saw it as divisive, of just appointing a few black or Asians into a position, which we still think is wrong. You've got to put it in a broader context than that. But when we came to power in Liverpool, that is, the militant supporters together with others controlled the Liverpool City Council, we then were faced with the discrimination against the black and Asian population in Liverpool 8, in which they had a very good case. They've been there for generations, by the way, because Liverpool is a port, goes back to the slave trade, like Bristol, where I've just been, goes back to the slave trade and so on. So we have an inheritance of that in the heart of Liverpool, where they were discriminated against, and still are, unfortunately, in jobs, in housing, in education, in opportunities and so on. We couldn't just come to power and say we're going to create a couple of thousand jobs when they were clamouring for their problems to be addressed. And we said, okay, there has to be a certain number of jobs going to Liverpool 8 to the black and Asian population, discriminating in their favour, if you like, within the context of this jobs and homes programme. But we managed to get support for it by making sure that the trade unions were involved. They were involved in the process. They sat on the committees to decide who would get the jobs and so on. And in that way, we took a step towards uniting the working class, recognising the rights of the minorities, but uniting the working class in the process of that movement. I would imagine something similar would be possible in India, of recognising, for instance, the rights of the Dalits, of having reserved occupations for them and greater job opportunities, but done not through the ruling class deciding, not through self-appointed experts, which will lead to conflict and fratricidal strife, but actually on the basis of the trade union and labour movement showing it's fair, it's open, and it can benefit all layers. Then you would get the Dalits and the non-Dalits and others who would see the fairness of such an approach.
Now, as we are going into the issue of the caste and how it is connected with the present day regime, which comes under the banner of Hindutva right wing. See, it is one thing to, as you said, the relics of the past, which is now dominating the scene, social and political scene. I mean, one can see from a Trotskyist point of view, the failure of the ruling class in developing the society to any degree. I mean, in fact, they have created new problems in the society because of their failures. And also the scandalous nature of the Stalinist theory itself in the country, how they have conducted themselves as the leaders of the labor movement. And today, while the discrimination is so stark and it is there to see, but yet what we can see in the industrialized, totally, I mean not totally, but industrialized societies where the trade unions embrace at least a significant proportion of the population. In India, the organized working class is still 3 to 5%.
Yeah.
Rest of the population, though workers themselves, they are not organized into fighting unions. In such a situation, the question of caste plays a very, very pernicious role, because there are certain trades that are reserved for the lower caste. For example, manhole cleaning. On an average of 10 to 15 people die every week in India because they get into that poisonous holes, and that is reserved for the Dalit this thing. And even if you look at the top of the communist parties, which should have been a kind of a beacon of hope for the entire working people, including the Dalits, there's absolutely 0% of the leadership, which comes, I mean, it should not come naturally or artificially, but they should, since they are the people of the working class, they should have been given the necessary leadership opportunities, but that is completely absent. And it is very unfortunate to say the entire trade union and the left leadership is dominated by one or two castes.
Well, that's very bad.
So in such a situation, is it not correct to say that leadership by example is a very important thing? You know, how to develop the real leadership, the real fighting leadership, because even in the recent period, that the Dalit assertion, the youth Dalit assertion is on the move, and you saw that in the student movement that you just referred. You know, unfortunate suicide by murder of Rohit Vemula, the research scholar in Hyderabad. But now the Dalit assertion is on the go, and I was told that 16th of February there's going to be an all India university strike in support of Dalit assertion. So in such a situation, how do we address a practical question of leadership of the Dalits? You know.
Well, the thing is, it is a many-sided and complicated thing. You've raised a number of issues there. One is on the trade unions, the low level of trade union membership. And that's not unique to India. In fact, in the neo-colonial world, you'll find quite a similar position. In Pakistan, I think it's down to 1% of the labour force. Now, that is a product partly of the cultural backwardness of many of these societies, of a certain deindustrialisation that's taken place, certainly in the case of India, where you had strong organisations in heavy industry and so on. And from what I know about the situation in India, that deindustrialisation has taken place. It will increase now on the basis of the present world crisis as it's developing. And that's a factor. But the other and more important factor is the attitude of the leaders of these organisations, like with Britain. Now, Lenin once said, in general, you will never get more than about 1/3 under capitalism. You'd never get more than 1/3 of the working class who will be organised into trade unions. Now, that particular position was undermined or falsified by the developments in the advanced industrial countries. Certainly, in Europe, in Britain, it went to over 50%. But it was in a unique period of a boom, which was an abnormal period for capitalism. It wasn't the norm. What we have now is the norm. This is the new normal of a world crisis, of a crisis in the neo-colonial world, and of no real recovery taking place since 2007, 2008. And in the course of these developments, there is bound to be revolts of working people, and there's been a certain atrophy from the top within the trade unions. So people leaders who become comfortable, who rationalise their position and say, well, the working class is not prepared to struggle and so on. And therefore membership in the trade unions in Britain has now dropped to maybe 25%. So it's dropped from more than halved, actually, since the classical period of the strength of the trade unions. Now that is aggravated in the case of India. And then the attitude, if then within the trade union movement and the labour movement, there is not a concentration on the most exploited and downtrodden. And by that I mean that sometimes if you have a really oppressed minority, they lack such confidence that they're not necessarily the best people to be, in the beginning, to join a trade union or to participate in the struggle. But that should be the aim, to mobilise the basic core of the working class. Sometimes the trade union movement develops, in Britain for instance, amongst the more educated workers who have a trade in industry or in printing and things like that. And I would imagine a similar thing developed at a certain stage in India as well. But we have to make sure that we open the doors to the most oppressed layers. I mean, for instance, we welcome people from any background, and from any caste for that matter, in India, who put themselves on the standpoint of the working class. If they're Brahmin, for instance, they come from the privileged layer. Well, if they put themselves on the standpoint of the working class and devote themselves to the struggles of working people, we can't fault them for that basis. You can't choose your objective situation no more than you can choose your parents. You know, it's a given fact that you can't choose your parents in that situation. So you come from that background, but if you come in with a Brahmin cast of mind, so to speak, to use a rather confused...
the mindset.
Yeah, the mindset. If you come in with that approach, then, of perpetuating the divisions, then you perpetuate the problem. We have many people come from a working class background, such as myself, never been to university, things like that, of workers who've developed through the struggle. We have comrades who come from a more educated, a more intellectual background. They put themselves on the standpoint of the working class. There are no divisions within our ranks. Where you have the broad labour movement, you have a special responsibility to promote the most oppressed layers, like women, for instance, like the Dalits and so on in India, to positions of influence and authority within the movement, but not in an artificial way. Not just because you're a Dalit or because you're a woman. The right wing in the Labour Party have tried to do that, of having reserved places for petty bourgeois women, not for working class women, not for fighters, not for strugglers, for the working class. And when it comes down to it, there are many feminists who say, well, it's a crying shame that we don't have more women in authoritative positions within the labour movement, and that's true. But by that they mean any woman. Now, Mrs. Thatcher was a woman Prime Minister. Mrs. Nehru in Indira Gandhi was a woman, and so on. But they're not preferable to a woman, but they carry through bourgeois politics. They carry through attacks on the working class. You know, Indira Gandhi introduced the emergency, the infamous emergency. I was in India when the emergency existed. It was a kind of semi-dictatorial regime when people could be pulled from their bed, arrested, put in prison and so on. No, it's first of all a class question. What are your politics? And then it's a question of promoting those people who are on the correct position of a genuine fighters, genuine socialists, genuine Marxists into positions in the labour movements.
So, comrade, you know, in the context of this 21st century capitalism, which is crisis-ridden, is there a possibility of a return of? I mean, this you have answered it in different questions through the different questions. Final answer is there a possibility of a return of a classical fascism on the world scale or in any country for that matter?
We could not rule out that capitalism, faced with a challenge from the working class, that they will resort to extra parliamentary means, what we would call, or semi-dictatorial means, and ultimately in an outright military dictatorship. That's possible in any country in the world, but it's not on the agenda at the present time, and it would take many defeats of the working class before even a military dictatorship could develop. As to whether that would be a fascist regime, well, the pendulum is swinging towards us and towards the left, in the sense that the middle class today are being radicalised mostly towards the left. We have this phenomenon of populism, which is reflected in Bernie Sanders in the US, who calls himself a socialist, and has got a phenomenal support. He's only 2 points difference between him and Hillary Clinton now. He could even win the Democratic nomination. That's unlikely, but it indicates that socialism is on the agenda in America. We have the phenomenon of Jeremy Corbyn, which represents the radicalisation. We have the doctors going on strike in Britain. Now that was a privileged layer, well, to some extent compared to the rest of the population it is. But they are adopting the methods of the working class, of going on strike, of sitting down on a cold, wet day in central London, of talking about solidarity and capitalism being broken. And it's the balance of forces, in other words, are overwhelmingly in favour of the working class. And at the same time, social democracy, the idea of piecemeal reforms, is busted. There's no possibility now of lasting reforms. What's given with the left hand will be taken back with the right hand. And what you have is a disappointment, mass disappointment, with the traditional parties. And of one section of the base of social democracy, the Liberal Party splitting towards UKIP in Britain, towards the National Front in France, towards Donald Trump and the Tea Party types in the US, and another layer going towards the left. And the layer that's going towards the left are the most important layer at this stage, because they have the possibility of introducing lasting change into the labour movements, of shifting the centre of gravity decisively towards the left, not towards reformism, but towards socialism, towards, moreover, scientific socialism, towards Marxism. And on that basis, if the labour movement's rearmed with a socialist programme and a socialist perspective, it can become the mightiest force. It will become the mightiest force in society. The difference between this century and the last century, the 20th century was the most bloody century in world history, in which you had, as a result of the failure of one revolution after another, we had Nazism, we had fascism, the same thing, we had Mussolini, we had Hitler, we had Franco in Spain, and we have the threat of similar types if the working class fails in this period. Only one victory, classical victory, of the working class in Russia. Why? Because they had a party, they had a programme, they had a party, they won the working class, and through them they won the mass of the peasants. The key is, in India, to win the working class to the idea of socialist change, and through them to win the mass of the oppressed peoples of the countryside. India is still a huge society of villages, with oceans, with islands of urban areas. But those urban areas have grown. At one stage it was a tiny minority. The most important thing about India is that the urban areas have grown, the people who live in the cities have grown, the rural areas have declined, the decisive sections of society are in the urban areas. We have to win the working class. We reject the Communist Party's position of Stalinism of the past, of a stages theory. We have to go for democracy first, allegedly. You've had the best of democracy, and it's produced the BJP. And if it continues to exist, it will produce worse than the BJP. It will produce a version of Indira Gandhi's emergency, only much stronger. That could happen in India. But before we get to that, there will be mass battles. And the working class, through victories and defeats, will learn in that. The younger generation in particular will learn. They'll rearm the working class. We'll be able to nip reaction in the bud. That's the lesson we have to draw from the 20th century. There's no automaticity in society. It's a question of the struggle, of developing the struggle to a pitch where you create an army of working class fighters who are able in turn to lead the masses behind them and carry through the greatest event in human history, which will be the socialist, democratic socialist revolution. That's on the agenda for the masses in India. That's on the agenda for the peoples of the world.